Okay. Okay. We can start our meeting, our conversation, not a very crowded conversation, but it's important for us to have a glance about the actual situation of the German Church, the Cattolic or religious landscape in Germany, and I'm very happy to introduce Professor Simon Linder. A sort of wishful thinking.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll accept it for today.
Okay. You know, Simon Linder, here in person on the photo, but Simon Linder is the Wissenschaftler Mitarbeiter at the Catholic Facoltà in Tübingen, and he has wrote his PhD dissertation about the effect of the internet, the media, and artificial intelligence on the synodic path in Germany in the last year. So, is the right person to introduce to us to the actual situation of the German Church, and especially to dialogue with us about the synodic path in the last year. The general movement started by Pope Francis to rediscover the synodality within the Church and the consequences on the life of the German Church and the impact of this path on some issues about synodality, but also about the role of the women in the Church, about the relation to some issues typical of the Western civilization, the problem of homosexual marriage and so on. So, welcome to Simon Linder, welcome also to people connected by internet to our session. It's a dialogue, so feel free to interrupt after 5 minutes, but we might have an exchange after Linder exposition, so we're going to have a word about 2 hours. And yeah, it's the first of 3 meetings we have tomorrow. Tomorrow, Linder will give a lesson within the course of Professor Raffaella Carino, Contemporary Christian History, and maybe more interesting for some of us, on the day after tomorrow, we will meet again here to have a conversation specifically about the relationship between each of theology and artificial intelligence. My last duty is to thank the European Union for this conversation, because Professor Linder is here, thanks to a program of Erasmus program of exchange of professors and professors exchanged between university, which is joining this Erasmus program. Thank you so much. The floor is to you.
Grazie mille. Qualche frase in italiano. Sono molto felice di essere qui e parlo un po' di italiano, ma non molto bene, ma se parlate lentamente posso capiscere. But now I'm switching to English because that's more easy for me. So thank you for the introduction. I'll say some more words, although you already said some words. I think I have to start the presentation here, right? Yeah, who am I? First of all, I don't like so much words about me, but maybe it's helpful for you because when I'm in Germany, I always say like you can like look on my website and whatever, but you don't have the possibilities because my website's only in German, and you won't know me because all the things I write are in German. So it's the first time for me going like international. So I want to tell you some more about as you already said, wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter, research assistant, I'm a postdoc at the University of Tübingen, Faculty of Catholic Theology, and I'm working at the chair of Practical Theology with Professor Michael Schissler. I'm currently working on a habilitation thesis, which is normally required when you want to apply for a professorship in Germany. And I'm working on the field of Catholics and assisted suicide from a practical theological perspective. I won't be presenting anything on that this week because still need some time, some years to work on that topic. But if you're interested in it, you can just come to me afterwards and I can tell you some more about it. This, of course, also applies to all other topics that you think about these days. When you say, like, I want to talk with him about this or that, just, come to me. I'm here. Of course, I'm getting lectures because he wants me to do that. I have to do that. I want to do that. But of course, it's for me most fruitful when I get into interaction with you and go to lunch or to dinner or to have a coffee just to get connected with you all. So I'm going to be most happy when I have a lot of coffee with all of you in this week and get to know many of you and about you, get to know what you're working on. I'll be here until Friday at the university, and I have time, so come up to me. Also, if you're interested in some text that I cite as a source today, I did not put all the book titles on the slides because most of them are German. But if you're interested in something, just tell me and tell you which book it is, where the citations. Okay, before I started my position at the university 3 years ago, I worked as a consultant for the German Catholic Youth Organization, BDKJ, it's called, as a consultant for church politics and youth pastoral care. In Germany, a lot of the youth work is organized through these associations. Maybe you know them. They have well over 500,000 members in total, like the Scouts and the Catholic Young Community, and the BDKJ, that's the umbrella organization for these associations. Parallel to my work there, I wrote my doctoral thesis. It's published, unfortunately, only in German under the title "The Disputing Church and the Digital Presence: Why Theology of Digitality Demands Synodality and the Culture of Dispute." And a large part of what I'm presenting to you here this week are results of the research for my thesis. But of course, positions are evolving. For example, I would deal more critical with the term synodality today. But yeah, also the topic of AI wasn't there when I was preparing or wasn't that large when I was preparing for the publication, and submitted it in mid-2022, and ChatGPT came afterwards, so that's not included in the thesis, but I thought about it last year, so some ideas to present to you. Before my doctorate, I studied in Tübingen, Catholic theology and also general rhetoric, possible in Tübingen, and now I'm back in Tübingen. Now some words about Tübingen. This is Tübingen. It's the most famous photo spot in Tübingen. You may know it. It's a small city near Stuttgart in southwestern Germany. It's one of the youngest cities in Germany for a very simple reason. Tübingen has 90,000 inhabitants and 30,000 university students. You see mostly young people on the streets. And there are over 200 degree programs in Tübingen, and we have 5,000 scientists. So the city is like extremely shaped by the university. People say there's not a university in Tübingen, but Tübingen is a university. The Faculty of Catholic Theology, where I work, has 14 chairs, 14 professorships, and currently about 300 students. So you see there's room for some more students. So if you have any students who think like, I want to go to Germany for like, I don't know, half a year or whatever, just come up to me and I hope we can arrange them. And maybe what's also interesting for you, we already talked about, is that the campus of theology is very new in Tübingen. We have the Catholic and the Protestant and the Islamic theology at one spot. So there's a new building, and Islamic theology is now with us, with the Christian theologies. This opens up new possibilities. That's also why we'll have the conference of the International Academy of Practical Theology in Tübingen in April 2027. So my subject is practical theology. You already said we have agreed to do 3 events this week. Today's event is titled Synodality and the Church in Germany, Events, Open Questions, and Perspectives. I will present the MHG study about sexual abuse in the Church in Germany and the synodal path that was started based on the findings about this abuse. Then I'll talk about the concept of synodality and one of my favorite topics, conflict, and about power in the church. And I will try to find an answer on the question if synodality is suitable as a perspective of hope. And then hopefully we'll have enough time to discuss all this what I'm presenting. Second event tomorrow, it's about, I like the title, it was his idea, not mine, it's Reigning Man, how the church deals with power. Thank you. I just read the mail and I'm like, okay, perfect. I like it very much. It's about the result of the discourse that I conducted for my doctoral thesis, but a lot of things that we'll present tomorrow overlap with the things I present today because everything's about power. So if you think about coming to a second lecture, maybe then the day after tomorrow is better for you because if you sit here again tomorrow, then you will have heard a lot of things already today. And the third event on Thursday is on Christianity, digitalization, and AI. I will there talk about digital society, where digital came from, digital church, theology of digitality, and some pieces on AI. For today, I planned to speak about 45 minutes, then small break, another 25 minutes, and then we have like half an hour for discussion. Yes. Okay. First things first, I think that's important when one is talking about sexual child abuse. That's a heavy topic. I will not report so much on individual cases, but also the statistics can be distressing because I think it has to be distressing. So if anyone is to say it's like, that's too harsh for me, I just need to go out for a second or something, like just do that, that's totally fine. I fully understand because I think the topic that must be distressing, yeah, when you're working with this, so take good care of yourselves. I received this magazine in my mailbox last week. It's a magazine about soccer culture, football culture, 11 Friends, and I brought it because the cover says you can understand it. Everything of us knew what was happening in cabin 2. That's the title of this magazine. So first thing I want to say is that child abuse, of course, is not a specifically ecclesiastical or Catholic phenomenon, but maybe you have heard this sentence before. In Germany, it has been heard very often because, you know, other social institutions have problems also, the Protestant churches, the sports clubs, and so on. The problems with the sentence is often its intention, because it's used to say like it's not that worse in church, that bad in church because other institutions have problems too. But this is wrong for 2 reasons. Firstly, sexual abuse does not occur independently of an institution's structures, but within them and also because of them. So the reference to other places like football clubs is not a reason to look less at the own structures. In truth, it's a reason to look even more closely at the structures of one's own institution. And secondly, in the Catholic Church, it is actually particularly bad, according to everything we know, both statistically and also for moral reasons, which I will come to later. I would now like to give you some data and facts from the MHG study that seem the most important to me. The MHG study is the study on sexual abuse of minors in the Catholic Church in Germany. And MHG stands for Mannheim, Heidelberg, and Gießen. Those are the 3 German cities where the institutions are based that made the study. I also recorded a podcast episode this while I was still working at the BDKJ. So you're speaking German, maybe you can listen to it if you're interested. In it, I talked with the main person who's responsible for the study, Professor Harald Dresing, who is a forensic psychiatrist. And I will cite him very often in the next minutes. I also read that there's a study published for the Diocese of Bolzano-Brixen some I think months or weeks ago, and that there is a study also for the whole of Italy is planned. But there are often like a few surprises when such studies are published. For example, I read that in Bolzano-Brixen there was abuse of many girls, which is like not common in the Catholic Church. But there are also often like continuities. I read that in Bolzano-Brixen there are 4.1% of the priests accused of sexual abuse, which is very similar to Germany and Australia and the US. So that's and Ireland too. So that's nearly the same. Now to the MHG study, it examined the period of 1946 to 2014. They reviewed over 38,000 personal files of clerics, and they found 3,677 indications of victims of abuse. And a high number of unreported cases is also assumed. Why is that? Because many people probably never came forward with abuse they had to live through. And second thing, because there was cover-up. This is also proven, especially when it's done very poorly. Professor Dresing told me that most of the personal files are not paginated, so it's easy to get something out of it, and nobody will ever have an idea of this. But he said, like, sometimes it's visible that it's very poor because in the end there's a sentence that says something happened. Look at the page second, and you look at the second page, but there's nothing on it. So that was page 3 before, and they just took it out. So that happened, and you can see that. There are 1,670 clerics accused, which is 4.1 of all diocesan priests from that time. And for 51 of them, there are indications of one victim, and for 42, there are indications of several victims, which goes from 2 victims to 45 victims. That was the highest number. Approximately in Germany, 2/3 are male, 1/3 is female. So there are significantly more boys than girls affected. And yeah, incidentally, according to Professor Dresing, normally there are more girls affected by sexual abuse in all other contexts. But in the Catholic Church, it's more boys that are affected. I will tell something about that. How the MHG study carried out was a third-party funded project. And all 27 dioceses assured that they would supply data, and they also did. And the researchers did not have the personal files themselves. They were analyzed by dioceses or by chancelleries according to the specifications of the researchers. Dresing says what they found is the tip of the iceberg. So the number of sexual abuse are certainly larger than everything that they found, because as I said, not everything was reported, and also because of the cover-up. I personally for a long time thought that it's a weakness of the study that they did not look into the files themselves and weren't able to like have them on their own table. But Professor Dresing told me like he also thought that in the beginning, but in the end he said it's like more of a strength of the study, because this is like the lowest number that is possible, because all the data came from the church, and now nobody can say like those university investigators found things that never happened. So everything that's in the study is coming from the church, and now he says like this is the basis, that's the lowest line, and of course there's more, but of course it hasn't been less than that. It's a minimum. The study included various sub-projects, for example, on the question of how the church dealt with the knowledge of abuse. There were also interviews on the question of the experiences of also the perpetrators and also of the victims. There were also interviews with priests who weren't accused and what might have been different for them. Also, there was an anonymous online survey which reached out to more younger victims. And it also said that like people often only open up after like 10 to 15 years after sexual abuse happened to them. So when they published the study in 2017, they knew that everything that was happening in the 2000s and 2010s wasn't able to be integrated, because many of the people just didn't tell anybody that they suffered from abuse in the church. I also read in the Bolzano-Brixen study that abuse has been decreasing since the 90s. To be honest, I'm not sure about it, because maybe in the 90s or in the 2000s there hasn't abuse, but the people just aren't able to tell right now. Maybe they are able to tell about the abuse in 10 years, 15 years. So we don't have to assume that sexual abuse in the church is a thing of the past. What are the risk factors? The MHG study identified 3 major things. First is clerical power, so the concentration of power in the church on priests. Second is that the church is a closed, male-dominated system. And the third, sexual morality. Of course, it's not possible for today to go into every detail, but I want to tell you with one example that sometimes it's more complicated than some people think. So, for example, is the topic of homosexuality, because some people concluded from the study, because of the high number of male victims, that homosexual priests are the problem, or that homosexuality itself is the problem, which is of course completely wrong. What is correct is that the tabooing of sexuality and the tabooing of homosexuality is the problem. So homosexuality, of course, is not a risk factor for sexual abuse. But the homophobia in the church, combined with structures in which there are only men, has been, as Professor Dresing told me, kind of a magnetic attraction to homosexual men who don't want to admit the truth about their own sexuality. And some of them try to solve their problems with their sexuality via celibacy, and of course that has to go on. So the mandatory celibacy plays a big role in giving the people the opportunity to kind of postpone dealing with their homosexuality, and that then homosexual men who are becoming priests primarily abuse boys is kind of logical, but it's not about homosexuality, but it's about the the institutional logics of the church that devalues and taboos homosexuality, and at the same time gives them a path to through which they believe they can deal with it. But the incorrect interpretation that I just mentioned, homosexuality is the problem, or homosexual priests are the problem, was also spread after the study. Also during the synodal path, there was one person who said it live. So you can see that it's not kind of a harmless misjudgment, you know, the person just didn't get what the study was saying. But of course, these misjudgments extend the problem because, again, a taboo is created because, again, it's said that homosexual priests or homosexuality is the problem. There were also other forms of accusations. One came from the former Pope, from Pope Benedict. He did not hold the homosexual responsible, but the sexual revolution of 1968. That was his argument. Maybe you remember that, which is, of course, totally wrong because we would have to see that the case increased from 1968. But that just didn't happen. So there was the same amount of cases before as afterwards. So that's just wrong what he said. And also I mentioned celibacy. Also celibacy is not a risk factor, but the way celibacy is handled. Because people who live celibate, so like single, out of the church, they're living single is not a risk factor to abuse children, of course. But for the Catholic clerics, living the celibacy is an entry ticket into a professional career. So the obligation of celibacy is the problem. Professor Dresing, I said it before, conducted interviews with accused and non-accused priests. And interesting is that the accused tended to say that celibacy made being a cleric particularly interesting, and the non-accused were in favor of abolishing it. So the non-accused priests said they didn't want to live celibacy, but they had to. So celibacy is a problem when it's not a free decision. So again, it's not an individual problem, but it's again structural. Also, the topic of cover-up was researched by Professor Dresing, and he knows that cover-up primarily occurs when two things are present. First is when violation of central ethical principles take place in an institution, and second is when institutions are strongly characterized by hierarchy and closure. So both things are undoubtedly present in the case of abuse in the Catholic Church or in the Church itself. So that's why finding a way to deal with the problem wasn't easy. And we also know that much more was covered up in the Church than, for example, in sports clubs. Now, the path that the Church in Germany has chosen is what I'd like to present to you next. Again, I won't be able to explain the whole process, very complicated. So if you have questions, we can clarify them, of course. But roughly speaking, all bishops from the German Bishops' Conference, BGK, and also lay representatives from dioceses, from associations, some explicitly younger people, met repeatedly over several years and discussed ideas for change. Most of the lay representatives were chosen by the Central Committee of German Catholics, called ZDK. That's the highest body of the laity in Germany, where representatives from the dioceses and from associations and other people from civil society work together. The ideas of the synodal path were prepared by 4 forums that dealt with the following topics: power and separation of powers, priestly way of life, women in ministries, sexual morality. And this, of course, made sense when you think about the MHG study, because clerical power, priestly way of life, including celibacy, the male-dominated structures, and sexual morality were the most important topics church has to deal with because of this. The Synodal Path passed various texts, such as the appeal for re-evaluation of homosexuality, about opening up of celibacy, also a request to examine the possibility of ordaining women to the diaconate, and so on. Also going into the details here would lead too far. But I have to say that opinions on if the Synodal Path was successful differ sharply. I would consider a large part of the efforts to have failed. I will elaborate on this with an example shortly, but if you would have invited another theologian from Germany, maybe they would tell you that it was a great success. And of course, we have both arguments. Maybe I have some more. I don't know. Yeah, but there are different positions on this. For transparency, I also had two roles in the Synodal Path. First, that is that we had from where I was working at the BDKJ, we had the possibility to send 15 young people into the Synodal Path, and I tried to accompany them while being there. And the second was that I was present at most of the assemblies because I operated the digital tool that they work with. It was not like, it wasn't working on the content, but it was only like a technical thing, but it was good for me because I was able to see everything that happened on site. So I didn't watch it through the live stream, but I was there and I got some money out of it. Okay, I told you about the term of Synodal Path. There's this word included, synodality, and I think it's important to take a closer look on the word synodality. It's now been 10 years since Pope Francis declared at the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Synod of Bishops in October 2015. He said, "The world in which we live, and which in all its contradictions we are called to love and serve, requires the Church to enhance its collaboration in all areas of its mission. Precisely this path of synodality is what God expects of the Church of the third millennium." In addition to global synods of bishops, he also addressed regional synods, which should contribute to a healthy decentralization of the Church. So after that, many actors asked themselves, what is synodality anyway? I brought to you quotes from two groups that couldn't be more different. The ZDK Assembly, the German Lays, adopted the paper Synodality, Structural Principle of Church Action in November 2016. And in it, the ZDK welcomes what the Pope says and demands to strengthen or form reliable structures that enable a high degree of participation in church decision-making processes at all levels, and very specifically for Germany, a body consisting of bishops elected by the Bishops' Conference and representative lay delegations whose responsibility is to regularly consult on the requirements for synodal decisions. So that was one perspective, and there's a second perspective on synodality from the Vatican's International Theological Commission. They state that the renewal of the synodal life of the Church requires activating consultation processes of the entire people of God, and also in order to arrive at a formulation of their own decisions, the pastors must therefore listen carefully to the wishes of the faithful. However, then the process of elaborating a decision, so the decision making, and the decision itself, so the decision taking, is strictly separated from each other. The Commission writes, the elaboration is a synodal task the decision is a responsibility of the office. And it's postulated the synodal process must take place within the body of a hierarchically structured community. So if you're confused now, that's like it's not clearly defined what is synodality. When you're reading, it's like you don't know. It's like everybody says something. So there's no firm basis where you can enter from into synodal discourses, because of course there's no agreement on what synodality actually is. Now you can of course regret this and try to push for theological clarification. Many people do that. They want to clarify what the term synodality means, but that will never happen because there's nobody who can clarify what synodality means. So the second option is to accept it and kind of see that the lack of the definition is kind of maybe a positive feature of the term, because then it's an opportunity to shape it. Yes, I will return. Now, there are different options for dealing with conflicts. I'd like to show you two opposing approaches and two completely different debates. First, that I want to show you is the approach of progressive theology to Pope John Paul's attempt to end the discussion about the possibility of the ordination of women with his letter Ordinatio Sacerdotales from 1994. Now, I will talk about that more tomorrow in the lecture. Now that the effort to end the discussion exists, is obvious because he writes, wherefore, in order that all doubt may be removed regarding a matter of great importance, a matter which pertains to the Church's divine constitution itself, in virtue of my ministry of confirming the brethren, I declare that the Church has no authority whatsoever to confer priestly ordination of women, and that this judgment is to be definitely held by all the Church faithful. So OS can be understood as a prohibition on speaking or discussion for the faithful. From the time OS was published, any critical comment from within the Church towards the magisterium is a transgression of this boundary. The content of OS is based on the Declaration Inter Seniores of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, which was approved and published by Pope Paul VI already in 1976. And the answer to the question of what Pope John Paul II based his attempted termination of the discussion on is detached from factual arguments, because he attempts to bring about the end of the discussion in virtue of his ministry. So he does not refer to any arguments, but he refers only to his papal authority. And he links the justification to his role in the discourse without referring to the arguments. Now, you can ask the question, why didn't already Pope Paul VI try to end the discussion in Inter Seniores? In the papal logic, no, because Pope Paul II justifies the attempted termination of the discussion that, and there it is where it gets very interesting, that the question had also become the subject of debate among theologians and in certain Catholic churches. So already Pope Paul VI tried to end the debate, but it didn't work. And now the reason for the second attempt is not that there were some new arguments from anywhere coming, but it's the idea that the discussion has to be stopped placed in the discussion itself. Pope John Paul writes that although the teaching that priestly ordination is to be reserved to man alone has been preserved by the constant and universal tradition of the Church, has been firmly taught by the magisterium in its more recent documents. At the present time, in some places, it is nonetheless considered still open to debate. So that's why he published OS. What happens then? Discussion continues, of course. The magisterium also comments repeatedly. And this is precisely because theologians express their opinions. Very prominently in Germany, Peter Biedermann, one of the most important Catholic theologians of the last decades. He wrote an article with the title Grave Concerns, an analysis of the apostolic letter Ordinatio Sacerdotales. Biedermann links the justification of his statements to his role in the discourse. He writes, "It is the task of a Catholic theologian to methodically analyze and critically reflect on magisterial documents." So with this, he declares in the very first paragraph of this article that there can be no prohibition on speaking for him. And with this, he tries to protect himself from sanctions by the magisterium by adopting this speaker position. In his explanation, Biedermann elaborates on why he thinks that the argumentation in OS is not convincing. He writes also, if unity is to be preserved, very careful listening to one another, a willingness to learn from all sides, and mutual respect are necessary. This applies to all the faithful, to theologians, as well as to bishops and cardinals. This sentence initially sounds like just an unspectacular marginal note, describing a very obvious fact, but in this context, it can be only interpreted as a serious accusation against the magisterium, because Biedermann with this reverses the accusation that the magisterium made, that the proponents of women's ordination endanger the unity of the church, and he reflects that on the bishops and the cardinals, because according to Biedermann, they are equally obliged to listen carefully and to show respect. And if this does not happen, then bishops and cardinals are those who, in his view, are endangering unity. In the doctoral thesis, I also analyzed some other texts. For example, from Sabine Demel, who's a canon lawyer. She wrote a text on women and church office foundations, limits, possibilities. And she writes, quite similar to Biedermann, however, a reduction of the discussion about women's ordination to the internal church question of equal rights can only be avoided if the Sensus Fidelium, theological science, and the church's magisterium recognize their mutual interdependence and therefore conduct an open dialogue on the topic of women's ordination. That is, take a position on the argumentation of the respective other side with sincere respect and at the same time with constructive criticism. What's standing in that is that the thing you can read out of it if you know it. It says that the respect and the criticism lags from the side of the magisterium. Also, Georg Kraus, dogmatic theologian, writes the article Women's Ordination, Desideratum in the Catholic Church. He writes, in fact, according to a broad consensus in contemporary dogmatics, it's an urgent desideratum of the science of the times that the discussion about the admission of women to ordination as deacons or priests be continued with theological arguments. He seeks to convey two things in its essay. In a first step, the discussion about the ordination of women should be reopened and conducted. And in the second step, women should be admitted to ordination because, according to Kraus, there's a theologically an unambiguous positive justification for the admission of women to all ordained offices. So you see, most progressive theologians repeatedly demand a return to the theological discussion about the content, also because they are convinced that they have the better theological arguments. The only problem is that they don't have a way of forcing the magisterium into the theological discussion about the content. The Pope does not depend on content arguments because he does not have to weigh theological arguments because he can just decide ex officio. Now, why do the theologians not engage in this discourse of power? I would say firstly, because this is not classical theology, because it's about power. And secondly, because if they would engage, they would not attack a flawed argumentation of the magisterium on a theological question, but more they would attack directly the power position of the magisterium. And it's possible that some theologians shy away from this conflict for totally understandable reasons, because the sanctions could be much harsher. You remember Hans Küng and what he said, and there was also an attack on the power, and you know what happened to it. So, however, one must state that the strategy of progressive theologians was, at least until today, not successful. But I brought to you a second approach to a conflict. Maybe we can learn something from it. I brought an example from the German football Bundesliga. At the beginning of 2024, fans from the organized fan scenes threw tennis balls on the pitch for several weeks. Maybe you heard about it, maybe some of you did. Why did that happen? Because the German Football League, the DFL, which is the organization between behind the first two football leagues in Germany, they decided to sell media marketing rights to an investor for about 2 billion euros. And the organized fan scene was against it because they were concerned about higher prices, more commercialization in the stadium, and so on. I'm not concerned about the content of this topic, of course, but I want to look at the type of reaction of a group that appears to have less power in the discourse. What was the fans' reaction? They took tennis balls into the stadium and repeatedly threw them onto the pitch when they tried to start the game. And then with that, they caused long game interruptions. There were demands very quickly raised in the media that the DFL and the fans should sit down at the table and talk together to end the protest. And the representatives of the DFL were also willing to do so. But the fans, and that's very interesting for us, I think, were not willing to do so. They continued to throw their tennis ball on the fields week after week after week. And in a podcast, the two of the leading fans of the group explained why they were doing this and why they were not talking. They say, well, generally you can say communication is always good. Communication is not always, but mostly a problem solver. But then he states, dialogue on the part of the DFL usually only takes place when the matter is to be calmed down or dampened down. And this invitation only came after the longer disruptive protests and is therefore clearly recognizable to us as not a dialogue on equal terms. When asked whether they shouldn't talk to each other to resolve the conflict, one of the fans explained, what would happen in the end? We would sit down at a table, they would explain their perspective and view of things to us. We would say, we can't agree with that. And in the end, you leave the room, having not brought the two opinions closer together, and they can say, we talked, the result was so-so, but we can push it through now because there was a dialogue, right? So from our side, everything has been said. It should please remain as it is, and football should not be sold off any further. So the situation seemed totally unsolvable, like the situation in the church with women's ordination. What happened then? First, one of the two bidders of the purchase of the rights withdrew their interest, and after that, the DFL completely canceled the project and declared a successful continuation of the process no longer seems possible in view of the current developments. So the fans had prevailed with their refusal to talk and with their tennis balls. Now let's take a quick look on the theory of behavior in conflict situations. As I said before, I don't want to compare two topics in terms of content, but I think what's comparable is the approach of the progressive theologians and the approach of the football fans. Jürgen Habermas asked once a very important question, namely how the design of an ideal speech situation is possible. And Habermas defines this as follows. We call ideal a speech situation in which communication is not hindered only by external contingent influence, but also not by constraints that result from the structure of communication itself. The ideal speech situation excludes systematic distortion of communication. Only then does the peculiarly unforced force of the better argument prevail. Following this, he names some prerequisites for it. Among other things, he explains, in the ideal speech situations, only speakers are allowed who, as actors, have equal opportunities to use representational speech acts. The symmetry of entitlements and obligations can be guaranteed by an equal opportunity use of regulated speech acts, that is, by the equal distribution of opportunities to command and resist, to permit and prohibit, to make and accept promises, to counter and demand accountability, and so on. So productive culture of conflict, according to Habermas' understanding, can thus arise where, before the actual thematic discourse, kind of a meta discourse is conducted that cleanses the following discourse of power relations. In his idea of the meta discourse, Habermas constructs a seemingly neutral space that, of course, can only exist in theory, because in practice, also this discourse is also affected by the power relations that it seeks to solve beforehand. In reality, there is no beforehand, because the space of this meta discourse does only seem neutral. Against Habermas, one can argue with Foucault that a strategic approach is needed by the parties involved within the discourse. And that's an approach that aligns itself with the power relations and attempts to proceed subversively, if you look from below. I would say that the difference between the two practical approaches of the theologians, the discussion about the ordination of women, and the football fans, the discussion about the investor, is similar to that between the two theological approaches from Habermas and Foucault. The theologians desire, according to Habermas, the discourse on content liberated from power structures, and the football fans see, according to Foucault, the necessity of acknowledging actual power relations in order to be able to fight them. I've developed three little points from the successful fan protests that seem generalizable to me, and I would like to present to them as the tennis ball method, like God with the wing. First is assess power positions. This means, for example, acknowledging when you are not on equal terms with your counterpart in a discussion or in a discourse. A conversation does not automatically create equal terms. Therefore, entering into a conversation process, just like refusing to enter into a conversation process, is not an act prior to a political process, but it's already part of the political process. This applies to the fans who were not involved in the vote on the investor, just as it applies to theologians with the magisterium, or generally to the laity in canon law. Second thing is adapt forms of action. Anyone who's in a lower power position in the discourse is not automatically without power entirely. The realization that you are in a different or in a lower power position should therefore not lead to passivity, but to a different form of activity. But that should be appropriate to your own position. There are creative forms outside of a conversation to bring about change, and they are also allowed to be inconvenient. See the tennis ball. And third is cultivate communication. One's own procedure should always be explained. The fans team communicated in a way they otherwise almost never do. Fan representatives spoke with the media, as in the podcast that I cited. They issued press releases. They distributed flyers in the stadium to tell the other fans why they are doing this. So they did not engage in the conversation with the league, but they communicated even more. That's why I would put a short break of like maybe 10 minutes, if that's fine for me, and then go on with dealing with power in the synod.
Thank you so much for the 10 minutes class. And so we can start again. Okay, we can start again and the second part of our conversation. It's been about that, that some question answer and discussion here and from all. Okay.
Okay. The question of expressing our positions is very interesting in terms of the culture of the conflict. But of course, as I said, you have to look at the conditions under which the expression of position happens. And central to the synodal path was that they were hell-bent on not stepping on Rome's toes. Benjamin Levin and Lukas Liegemann report in an article for the Herder Correspondence, which is maybe the most important German theologian magazine, about changes to the draft statutes in the run-up to the synodal path. For example, the following sentence was deleted. They, which means the resolutions acquire legal effect through the entry into force by individual diocesan bishops. This sentence contains an expectation for implementation. Instead, there was a new sentence implemented. It said, resolutions of the Synodal Assembly do not of themselves take on legal effect, which means that it was emphasized that nothing had to come out of it. So the bishops were relieved of responsibility. And it's also interesting what happened to the sentence about resolutions whose topics are reserved for the universal church regulation, according to Levin and Liegemann. The older version said that they would be additionally forwarded to the Apostolic See, which leaves the openness to become active in Germany even without Rome. The new version then states that these resolutions shall be transmitted to the Apostolic See as a votum of the synodal. So Levin and Liegemann speak of a German wish list for the universal church. The potential synodal path was structurally contained even before it began, and in the debates, the focus returned to content, leaving structural questions aside. My thesis on that is that by attempting to legally secure its procedure under canon law, the synodal path incorporated itself into the very structures that, based on the MHG study, it was its original task to criticize. So thus the mistake is made of thinking only within the canon law system that co-created the problems in the first place, talking about clerical powers. And thus making the same mistake that progressive theology has been making for decades, for example, regarding the ordination of women. So please don't misunderstand. Of course, you can say that the church in Germany has taken some small steps forward. ZDK President Irmestetter-Karp cited successes such as the introduction of blessing ceremonies for loving couples, referring, for example, to same-sex couples who are denied a church marriage. or the introduction of preaching by women, or the request to the Pope to examine the abolition of compulsory celibacy for priests. But if you compare that with the clear demands that the ZDK had before the process, including equal participation of the laity and the ordained in the leadership of the church, equality of men and women, and access to our church offices for women, the results of the synodal path are not particularly far-reaching. The ZDK's original demand that clerical power structures be broken up promptly was definitely not met, and President Stetter-Karp declared also, without a doubt, I would have wished for more. After the scandal of abuse, I think that the church should not consider what seems possible within canon law logic, but implement what is necessary. This did not happen on the synodal path, because even though it discussed reforms in terms of content, it nevertheless fit into church power structure. So the synodal path made the mistake of only moving within the canon law system that co-created the problem in the first place. Essentially, I'm sure that the committed laity got everything they could get out of the process itself, but because the process as a whole was within the church's power structure and within the canon law system, and not more was possible. Now the question is, how do you get out of this if you don't want to bring tennis balls to an assembly? My perhaps somewhat provocative suggestion is to make it a central criterion of participation in synodal processes that they must not integrate themselves into the classic hierarchical church structures. Every now and then it may be necessary to choose the tennis ball method and to jump over canon law boundaries that structure the debates. If you wonder how that should work in the church, I've brought to you an example from church history from the Second Vatican Council. At the beginning of the Second Vatican Council, the Curia wanted the bishops to vote on the composition of the commissions. They had prepared lists of names that the bishops were only supposed to rubber stamp. And that was, of course, an attempt of the Curia to bring the council under control, because they wanted to have pre-selected the people who are in these commissions. Cardinal Achille Lienard, French bishop, then said to one of the session presidents, Cardinal Eugène Tisserand, who was sitting next to him, Eminence, it's impossible to elect this way without knowing anything about the most suitable candidates. If you permit, I would like to speak. What happened then? Tisserand rejected the request of Lienard because there was no discussion planned for this agenda item. What did Lienard do? He stood up anyway, he took the microphone and publicly requested that the election be postponed for a few days so that the bishops would have time to get to know each other. Then there was surprising and long applause, which left the session presidency no choice but to comply with the request. Perhaps Cardinal Lienard is a good role model because he followed the tennis ball method. He first had to acknowledge that he was not on equal terms with the session presidency because the rules had been set differently. There should be no discussion. But he did not become passive. He became active because the Microsoft was open and he used it to speak to all the bishops. And there he communicated his position. Proceeding in this way is risky because you don't know what's happening next, even to yourself. And you can certainly maybe think of more recent examples of such action. In Germany, maybe you heard about it. There was the initiative out in search of queer people who are professionally or voluntarily active in the church. 125 people came out. That's homosexual, bisexual, transgender, intersexual, or non-binary in the beginning of 2022. This was also accompanied by a documentary that aired on German public television during prime time. So what did they do? They did not wait for recognition. They showed to the church in Germany, we are here and we're staying here and we're not going away. Finally, small thought experiment about the synodal path. I think there was one moment where the ZDK felt, at least in my impression, I was in the room, I was watching it, very powerless. And that was when a good third of the bishops rejected the paper on sexual morality. There has been a paper had been prepared that was supposed to open up new perspectives on the topic. It has been discussed for a long time and also decided in the forum that it should be introduced to the General Assembly of the Synodal Path. There were also some hearings in preparation. There was also a hearing specifically for bishops to explain the paper to them and, if necessary, seek feedback. To my knowledge, there was no bishop who participated in these hearings. And then there was also a discussion in the Synodal Assembly, and I also don't recall critical statements from bishops during the debate. In the end, there was the vote, and because there had not only to be a two-third majority of all the people in the synod, but also a two-third majority among the bishops, we also waited for that, and then in the end, over a third of them rejected the paper, and the paper had failed. And afterwards, many of the bishops did not want to say how they would vote because it was the first. The city dean of Stuttgart, Christian Hermes, then spoke in the Synodal Assembly of some bishops as cowardly snipers. So the outrage was directed against bishops, which was certainly understandable. But for me, I think more interesting is the perspective that's taken by the ZDK, because all of the ZDK, or nearly all of the, almost all of the ZDK delegates had approved of it. The ZDK had various options and decided to continue the discourse with the ZDK within this framework, and regularly after that granting the bishops interruptions of the session to further votes so that the process remained under control and further scandals could be avoided. So time to time it happens that some bishops said break and then they got into their room and discussed again, only the bishops were in the room and they discussed how it goes on. All the other people were waiting for it. It was an understandable decision, of course, but at least for me, another understandable decision would have been to leave the session and go home. The question is, what would have happened if they would have thrown the imaginary tennis ball like that? They would have said, okay, you have a chance to discuss with us, you do. You just said, no, we. The crucial thing about the answer to this question is that we don't know what happened, what would have happened. Everyone certainly has assumptions, but we don't know. Because it would have led to the ultimate loss of control for everybody, because the control process would also have slipped out of the hands of the ZDK. Perhaps it would have happened that, and I think many in the ZDK had this thought, that the synodal path would have been over, that all the other papers would have been prepared for nothing, that the good resolutions that they had prepared could no longer have been passed, and in the end they would have been achieved less. But perhaps something else would have happened. There could have been a big media outcry because of what the bishops did. They would have gotten under pressure. They would have to approach the ZDK, and in the end, the ZDK would have achieved more. What there certainly was not was kind of a red line in the synodal path. That is, if that happens, the ZDK, instead of continuing to talk to the bishops, they would just go away. They didn't have such an idea in mind. But now, if you're asking whether such an approach, according to the tennis ball method, still has anything to do with synodality, my honest answer to that, linking back to the beginning, is that I cannot answer this question for you because there is no universally valid definition of synodality. So what approach is appropriate given to the problems to be addressed? In the end, I would say everyone has to decide that for themselves. Sometimes it may be engaging in a conversation process, and sometimes it may be the text. Now dealing with the power in the global sense. Even though many have looked at the reform process in Germany, and there is also, maybe you know that, occasionally in a letter from Rome from time to time trying to dictate the course. There are also synodal processes in other countries and of course at the level of the universal church. And I would now like to briefly address the Global Synod on Synodality, which convened for its first session in Rome in 2023 and met its second time in October 2024. At first, I want to show you two images and just ask you for a second, what do you notice? And what would you say this indicates about the meeting? What would you say? On the left, it's from a synod for this one, and the second picture is from the synod on synodality.
Chiede qual è la differenza che vede, quello è un sinodo, diciamo, dei vescovi, questo è il sinodo globale. La differenza è quella di una parte della gerarchia e diciamo democrazia.
So that all the synod right. What do you notice?
Oh.
First, okay, sorry. No, okay. It's different way talking to each other.
Yeah.
So, but then I would also add that there are women in the picture. So first thing I noticed because
Sure.
I'm quite sensitive.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I'm a woman, because there are many women that don't agree with me. So, but yeah.
What would you say this indicates about the discussion? Would you say that indicates something?
It also underlines the uniform in the picture.
That's the hierarchical structure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more democratic, so to say. Discussion about without a clear destination. Because at time you have arrested or speaking to somebody, speaking on the Sabbath, you don't know who is the final destination. What is the final destination of this speech?
Yeah, everything is true. But my thesis would be that the change does not indicate anything. But why? So the first, I would say that it means nothing. Okay. Why is that? It could be that something changes for the positive because there's different dynamic, because people are sitting on tables, there are women there and so on. Young people too, but there's a second option too, that also, I would say that there's a possibility that something changes for the negative, because on the right, the power is made invisible. And when power is made invisible, sometimes it can work even better. So that's the second option. And the third option is that nothing changes that. So I would say that because I was recently at a conference where professor said, like, you can see what changes, or you can see what changed with those two pictures. And I would say you can't see anything because you don't have to look at the structure, how people are sitting there, but you have the structure, how the dialogue or the discourse is constructed. I would say it means nothing. Okay, maybe a little bit provocative. Don't be impressed by images, and also don't be impressed by sentences either. Perhaps the most important sentence came from Pope Francis. I already quoted it. The world in which we live and with all contradictions. We are called to love, and serve requires the church to enhance its collaboration in all areas of its mission. And then he says, precisely this path of synodality is what God expects of the church of the third millennium. In 2015, Pope Francis, in the same speech, said that the church is halfway in implementing the Second Vatican Council's desire for more synodality. Now, when he says it's halfway, we have to look at it and take a look at which developments have taken place since the Council. Perhaps surprising observation by the sociologist of religion, Hans Joas, is that he describes that the changes in the self-understanding of the church, as the Council proclaimed in the 60s, were barely translated into structural reforms. Some reforms even pointed in the opposite direction. For example, the revision of the Connexiones Canonici of 1983 that deleted the idea that in every diocese a synod should take place every 10 years. So it took that just out of the CEC in 1983. So that Pope Francis saw the church in 2015 already halfway, despite these developments, does not lead to high expectations. Now, was the Synod on Synodality able to overcome the ambiguities in the definition of the term, or prepare or even implement Council-inspired reforms on canon law? I personally don't think so, because many who placed hope in the Synod seem to be hoping for, what I said, aside from Habermas, the unforced force of the better argument, which Habermas researched. He desires the ideal speech situation in order to arrive at common results. And the second picture shows maybe what you would think of an ideal speech situation. But those who consider such an ideal speech situation possible must probably admit that the reality at the Synod is different. There were many clerics, few lay people, many men, few women, many old people, few young people. And in the end, one person alone decided, that was at that time 86-year-old clerical man. So the notion that the best argument prevails in such a situation has to be an illusion, because it disregards the central component of the discourse, and that's the operation of power. Now, some will object that there already had been changes, even in the Synod. For the first time, there was a woman, Sister Nathalie Becard, who had the right to vote. The delegates sat in table groups, set of rows. Then there were topics against whose discussion the Vatican long resistance were being addressed. But however, all those decisions were intended to lead to somewhat more participation, were made monarchical. That is, in a very mode that in the imagination of Catholics, hoping for such reforms ought to be overcome, which is a kind of a self-contradiction. Perhaps synodality is kind of an ironically broken, and thus a very accurate description of the fundamental problem of this institution. The term conveys the historical and contemporary experience that the Church is structurally incapable of changing its own decision-making and decision-taking processes. Small changes like those mentioned previously are then more kind of a self-assurance by the organization that it still possesses the capacity for action at all. But the monarchical system reproduces itself at its foundations, and in doing so, it disempowers the bishops at the universal church level. If they advocate, as happened in the Synod of the Amazon, for the admission of viri probati, the Pope just dismissed it. So how could reformers in such a situation have hope for decisive steps towards the admission of women to ordained ministries from the Synod of Synodality? We know that synodality is unlike to share the to shake the monarchical system can already be read from the statement by Pope Francis at the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the Synod of Bishops that I cited at the beginning. Just have to look closely. He said precisely this path of synodality is what God expects of the Church of the third millennium. So the Pope knew what God expects of the Church for the nearly next 1,000 years, and he obviously did not agree with it. Some theses on synodality, a few critical thoughts. When I started, I already said that when I started to write the doctoral thesis, I was really positive about the idea. While writing it, I was getting so-so because I read the Facultà wrote, I wrote the National Commission, Theological Commission wrote, and that did not match. And today, I would say I'm very critical because, synodality has become kind of an ecclesiastical political term of longing. I already mentioned the hope of the ZDK in Germany, for example. Thomas Söding, who's the ZDK vice president, also professor, theology professor. He was also participant in the Global Synod. He wrote a new book, and he said that this neologism, synodality, creates space for real reforms. But to this day, what synodality means is contested. Cardinal Victor Manuel Fernandez recently, with the effect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, recently spoke of a distorted form of synodality that wants a democratic change of doctrine, to which we must say no and recognize that it is only the claim of some ideological minority groups. The Vatican position that he takes is based on two convictions. First is that the estates of clerics and laity must remain separate. As I said, the Vatican's International Theological Commission separates the process of elaborating a decision from the taking of the decision. The elaboration is a synodal task, the decision is a responsibility of the office. And second, a change in the consultation process, inviting more lay people, round tables at the Synod and so on, leads to greater acceptance of decisions, what the Vatican does. And the structure of the decision taking does not to be touched for this. In reality, I would say it's the other way around. Only the redistribution of decision-making power, decision-taking power, changes the process and consequently leads to more acceptance. However, this is not desired by the Vatican. Thus, synodality has become a clerical fighting term against inner church democracy. You can read what Fernandez says. Better arguments, for instance, in combating the sexual abuse of power by clerics, do not prevail in such synodal structures. So I'm very curious whether synodality will still serve as a term of longing for reform movements in 10 or 15 years. But now, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you so much for this very, very interesting and also moving discussion about the process of synodality, even though we don't know what it is, of course. But now we have some minutes of question, discussion, and so on. I would like just to have another small example of the problem that synodality, but also the process of decision making in the church has encountered here. For instance, you know that Pope Francis created a commission of historians and theologians about the question, about the problem of the femininity. And a friend of mine, Professor Facoltà, was in the first commission about that. And told me that work as those as fine that existed in the past. But the results were complicated. conference nominated another one, a second commission. Also, the second commission, friend Francesca was didn't enjoy the second commission, but the result of the second commission has not been made public. Never been. That is clear sign that they were the same of the first commission. And so, but insanely, the results were covered up by the steps that this document probably went through the Vatican. So that is the problem. The problem, as we make clear, is that there is a structure of power, or a structure that works for itself. This way it's wrong. But I am a bit more confident because I remember what Pope Francis said about the reform of the church. It's not so important the result, it's important to start process. Maybe we will see in short if the process started by Pope Francis are going on or will be stopped by the subsequent situation and so on.
I don't want to interrupt you. I just wanted to check if there was someone online and then.
Okay, because for instance, at the moment we have a couple of women as the chairwoman, not chairman, of some congregation in the Vatican, one for the ladies, one for the monks, with my monks and so on. We will see in short if the Pope will confirm them. And I think that will be an important indication of the future of the reform of the Papal process started by Pope Francis, or if all the conditions, the whole structure of the we are going to came back to those are only made priests. So that's for I hope of course that the process that is not, but I'm not sure. But I think that some steps made by Pope Francis are not so easy to delay. Just to give an hint of the
We should be.
but thinking of hope, diciamo, è ovvio che gente so the floor is open. Investment, education. Also some.
So first of all, thank you so much. Even because I think you brought fresh air in here. I mean, we don't have as you know, we have many courses of history of Christianity, history of church, that sort of, and we have a course of history of theology, but we don't have theology as a course because of Italian history and the history of the relationship between the church and the state. But even when we talk about any topics relating with present days, we usually avoid these kind of subjects because they're quite controversial. So I'm happy that someone from abroad really brought our attention this subject. It's not only synodality, but what synodality means, and the reflection on controversial subjects like women ordinary. So thank you. Really, I really appreciate it. I'm eager to listen to you tomorrow as well. What I actually wanted to, I had many questions, and maybe we will have the chance to discuss. But you said that you participated in this process. And what I wanted to ask you is what is your reception on what people think about what has happened, what is happening? And do you have the feeling that there is a difference between what the hierarchy thing, even in talking about hierarchies, organization, but and what the younger maybe, quite young, and yeah, your experience as a Catholic, someone engaged in the field, and you noticed a difference of thinking, feeling the subjects, and so yeah, maybe this first one.
I would say that before the MHG study, many people, I think young people in the Catholic Church were like, we're not happy with it. We can make church kind of a better place. And after the study, it became more like not making it better, but making it okay or making it good, because we learned from the study that it's a bad place for many young, or it's been a bad place for many young people in the last decades. So I would say that the idea of making it better changed to the idea of making it not that bad anymore as it is. So that's kind of less positive when you look at it, because it's kind of a not anymore kind of a like getting everybody together, making it positive, but it's more like they have to stop abuse children. So, and then the process started, and people were like really hoping, young people also were really hoping that they address the problems that the MHG study pointed out. And what then happened is that the process became very long, also because of COVID, but also not only, because also some of the forums just didn't work together, so they were just like not meeting, was not getting forward. And many of the people who participated in the process, who did that voluntarily, they put the most energy in it. And many of them just said, like 3 or 4 years later, there are some bishops who like they get paid for coming here and they do not prepare anything, and I'm coming here voluntarily and giving my free time to the church, and bishops come and just say, you know. And there are some people who there were young people getting sick through the whole process. I know one person was just getting sick because he was so he was like losing all of his hope that something gets better. But also on the other side, I did the same, or I nearly did the same presentation to the ZTKs 1 year ago, and I told them, in my eyes, you know, you could have made some things different. And when they asked me if I want to present my thesis on synodality, I told them that I think that they don't want to hear it because it's like I'm criticizing the whole approach. So I said, like, maybe you should get somebody who's like maybe a little bit more positive about it. And then they said, no, you should come tell us. And I told them the things that I told you. And in the end, there were some people who were like saying, yes, and that's why we have to go on with the process. And I'm like, what was I telling you in the last hour? So there are also like people who are so involved in the processes that in my eyes they are not able to see that there are possibilities like outside of a structured canon law process. And there are some who are still willing to participate, certificate people mostly, and many others just gave up their hope and just like get out of the church. This is what we're seeing right now. We don't have many students anymore in Catholic theology. It's difficult to have a faculty with 40 professors and 200 students, because it won't be long that the university will say, that's too much. In other faculties, we have like for 200 students, we have one professor. We have 40, and people, like young people, do not start studying theology anymore because they don't want to get into the church as church workers. They don't want to get to become religion teachers anymore. When I started studying theology at 2012, I think there were like 60 who started studying, and now I think it's 20 people who are studying. So it decreases massively, and people are just getting out of it, or they try to build their own little space, their own little community inside the church, in the church associations where they have democratic processes, and they are leading their own leaders, and they are just like saying the whole church is not working as it should be, but we have like our small community and it's working. So I would say this.
I totally agree with it's studying in English because
You can also speak in German. Okay. Everybody knows German, but you have to speak slowly.
Okay. Besonders wichtig ist Angelegenheit, verschiedene Perspektiven zu untersuchen, warum eine Furcht ist, dass die Kirche in Deutschland diese geschichtliche Perspektive ist. So, diese selektive Kommission in Deutschland, die Kommission für Zeitgeschichte, solche Katholizismus bleibt, eine sehr enge Verbundenheit mit der Deutschen Bischofskonferenz hatte, bis heute. Die Bischöfe haben entschieden, die Finanzierung zu der Mission zu stoppen. Und meine Angst ist, dass es notaren das Risiko läuft, diese Polarisierung zu verlieren, um die Beziehungsgeschichte zu suchen. Weil meine Perspektive ist, dass uns die Geschichte lernt, die Schwierigkeiten der Sache besser zu verstehen. Und eine zweite Idee ist, dass die Besonderheit des deutschen Katholizismus und der deutschen Kirche ist, dass sie diese sehr Offenheit zur Gesellschaft haben, die wir keine haben. Wir haben keinen Verbandskatholizismus, also wir haben keine katholische Öffentlichkeit. Und das erklärt uns, warum die deutschen Katholiken so offen zum Beispiel zur ökologischen Frage, zur Machtfrage. Diese Themen sind bei uns in Italien keine Themen. Ich war Anfang September bei einer Workshop in Bochum, der die Beziehungen zwischen Ökologie und Christentum diskutierte. Ich habe ein Referat über die italienische Katholizismus und die katholische Frage und sagte, was ich schon gesagt habe, also bei uns in Italien gibt es keine öffentlichen Diskurse über ökonomische Fragen. So. Diese sind meine zwei Themen, also Beziehung zur Gesellschaft, Beziehung zu Geschichte.
Insomma, more history, less common law.
Yeah, yeah.
Cercare di tenere
No,
insieme
sì.
le cose e poi anche, diciamo,
Sì, no, ma era una battuta.
sì, c'è un'interdisciplinarità occupare in Italia, Theologen, Storia, Chiesa.
Can have a better specification. The problem is that the first in Italy, theological faculties were pulled out of the university after the foundation. And in this way, it is impossible to theologian to have a day-by-day talk with the other colleagues, different disciplines. Of course, theologians deal with the issues and so on, but and after the Second Vatican Council, the Italian Church decided to maintain this separation between the theological faculties and the ecclesiastical authority. And so this is explain why in this Catholic university we cannot have a faculty of theology. We can have, yes, we can have a moral philosophy, systematic philosophy, theoretical theology, and so on, but no theology.
But you see that in Germany there's a contrary. I mean, in the Theologische Fakultät, there is Kirchengeschichte, but they are taught by theologians, not by historians. So,
Yes, but as I know, the German universities, they are so secular, or it's things that my friend Alphonse Fleury in Università, yes, it's formally a theologian.
if you want to teach Kirchengeschichte, you must have it.
Same, come on. Yes, but
Yeah, I mean, it's not.
some historians della teologia, yes, but more historians than what theoretical philosophy. So, yes. Also, Marx is much more an historian than a theologian, of course.
I think with history, I'd say like, I think it's important, yes. But I would also say that like history cannot give you like there are sometimes there are new things like when the Pope I think you mentioned the idea that they looked for there ever was a diaconate of women in the Catholic Church, and then they had the problem that they found it, okay, but why does it have to be sometimes? So why can't he make just new? So it's like, so I think history is like helpful and specifically when it said that it has been there, but I would say like sometimes there should be there can be innovations. Also because I think that the writing of church history has been very selective because like child abuse is a part of church history, but nobody has researched it before. Or in Germany, for many people, it looked like it's a new topic starting in 2011, and we already had moved from Ireland from the 90s that there's abuse, and honestly, I don't recall. I don't know any church historians who said like, let's look into the abuse history of Catholic Church. So yeah, and also in Germany, it's like something that maybe happens in the last years, but it's always not considered, or for many people, it's not considered as an as a theological topic, but it is one. And I think that's something that happened after the MHG study came out, that people were getting that there's a specifically Catholic way of using children, and that's after that, of course, it's a topic for society too, and maybe this will happen in Italy too, when you get a big study. That I think it's worth because I can't imagine that it's totally different results, and not only in the numbers but also in the clues that we have to address. So maybe it will start. And in Germany, we now have more discussion about money, because a lot of money comes from the state to the church, because of some 100 years ago felt better from secularization, and now people are starting the discussion about, shouldn't we cut this, because we see what church is as an institution, and if they, like many on the left say, it's not like they are not doing the job that we want them to do, but it's also like it can be very difficult for children to be in the church. And now I think also because of that those topics are discussed more openly, because society has linked, in Germany, society has linked Catholic Church with child abuse, and I think this has kind of this has some results that we are seeing right now. And unless the church is not addressing it, doesn't deserve to be done otherwise.
But I think that there is another risk or temptation giving more weight to the history. Catholic historiography or Catholic historians would have the temptation to stress the elements of continuity within the church history more than the elements of rupture and discontinuity. So I've just given you another example. In the last document of the International Commission about the Council of Nicaea, was generally written by historians, women historians, about the most important decision taken by the Council of Nicaea that was not regarding the, but was about the date of Easter. The Council, or the source of the Council, made absolutely clear that the decision to split off the date of the Christian Easter from the date of the Christian, of the Hebrew. That was the main decision. That was the most important decision that was immediately effective for the knowledge after you said it was a lot of debate about clearly from the source that was taken against it. It's a clear letter of Constantine in which Constantine illustrated and informed all the bishops all over the Mediterranean world about the decision. Said especially there was black Jews, they killed Jesus, so there we cannot share the date of the hours or the year. And the Theological Commission says, oh no, that was not a decision taken by the Council. We have no proof that it was taken by the Council. It was a decision by Constantine. So, you know, it was clear taken by the Council. It's clear that Constantine was very happy about that decision, but it's completely historical to attribute such a decision only to Constantine, to say we have no evidence about the father of the council agreed with the subject. That's clear. The temptation I was speaking about before. Since now we have to negate that, Catholic Church has to do with anti-Semitism.
Sure.
Yeah, we have. Also, I was very, we, in some ways, Catholic historians have to deal with the same difficulties that Catholic theologians has to deal with, because if you say that Catholic Church has made wrong about this, if you speak about the second or third century, yes, okay.
Yeah.
But if you can closer to the
Yeah.
present, difficult. So I am historian, but I know that there is also of the historian the same of the theologians. Just a consideration. Any other questions?
Because mine was a question about what you just said about the minority inside the church and the groups that decide that, okay, maybe we can do it by ourselves. I was wondering if we can't agree, so there are these two poles, the traditionalists, conservatives, and more progressive, just to simplify. If the church, meant as the hierarchy, can deal with this, sorry, they say that Leo the 14th has to put the church together again. Many journalists say that we have to unite the church, and the church must be reunited, as Francis wanted to speak that. But this is okay. But what I wanted to ask you is, do you think that the church is a to you as a theologian and as a big person involved in this? Do you think that the church is going to a future of thinking herself as a minority, and it's okay with it? I mean, in the history of the church, we see the church that wants to be the majority and must be recognized by the society with the power to be the majority. What if now the church think of herself as the minority and deals with it, and it's okay?
I think one sentence first to the idea of like reuniting. I would say that, I'm not a historian, but I would say like that the church has never been united. It's only like people didn't know what other people did in other countries. You know, like in Poland there are no diaconds until today, I think, or some years ago. So it has never been a problem for church to be in, like in Congo, they have their own rights and so on. So it's like it was normal to be different. One country than in another, or in the city, there was another church, and in the land it was all Catholic church. And I think it's a modern problem that people see. Oh, they're in Poland, it's different, or in Italy or in Germany, it's different. So I think the idea of reuniting doesn't work, because would have to like put press on people, and they will on the question of minority. Question is when are you a minority? You know, there are in Germany, I think some 1 or 2 years ago, there were like people, the media said like there are now first time less than 50% Christian. So more German people are not Christian. What the hell is being Christian? You know, it's like, is it you are baptized? Is it you are part of the church? Is it you are going to Sunday service? Is it you are influenced by the ideas of like to help people or whatever. So what is that? So I would say if the idea of the church as an institution would be that becoming of a minority, I think some people do that, creates a new strength for a smaller community. So like link people stronger together, builds new communities that are kind of evangelical, but like Catholic evangelical. I think there is the idea of when you are becoming a minority, then there's the holy, say, Heiliger Rest. I don't know if you know that, holy rest people, and then from these groups that are very, very Catholic, very engaged, then it can grow again. I would say that this is like the institutional logic of 20th century, because like in modern century, in the 21st century, we know that group forming doesn't work like it worked decades before. And if we say like now we try to make one like a minority church, but in the hope that it's like getting more convincing or more Catholic than it was before, then I think that would be right. But it's happening. You see some of the bishops who are in Germany are trying to like build small communities and with young people and hoping to make a smaller but more Catholic church. And I would say can go.
Also the idea of Ratzinger about the idea of the creative minority. So I think it's all about the impact of the social structure and the social also politics.
Minorities are more conservative.
Yeah,
they are.
And when we think about Second Vatican Council, we said about that you cannot think about the church as another thing than society, but you have to think like more like the ideas are linked, or that being Catholic means being part of the society. That's something that I don't know if they've forgotten, or they just don't want it because they want to have maybe a smaller church that is more conservative. Yeah.
Any other question? So we can thank then the lesson. Yeah. They are
Beautiful new building.
Yeah.
With all the connectivity tools and they are here again. Thank you so much to all, and now we are going to together. Thanks.